Part three of this history tea starts now. We left off talking about segregation and de jure segregation versus de facto segregation. So, de jure segregation is segregation that is enforced by the law. De facto segregation, on the other hand, is segregation that's really enforced by the culture. So I'll give you an example of de facto segregation. Brown versus the Board of Education was a national Supreme Court case that desegregated public schools in America. My mother graduated in the 1970s. She graduated from an all Black school. Now, even though desegregation was supposed to happen with all deliberate speed in 1954, shortly after, nearly 20 years later, she still graduated from a segregated school, and that's mainly because of de facto segregation. It was the habit and the custom of the races to stay apart. Okay, I will continue with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington, I used to feel, I would say, some type of way, as the young people say these days, about Booker T. Washington. A lot of the times when you're studying African American history, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are often pitted against each other. Um, and yes, they have a period where they fall out and where they don't see eye to eye. However, I don't think we should naturally pit them against one another. I will say we are all products of our environment and our upbringing. And so when we talk about Du Bois, and we will talk about him and we'll compare him to Washington, you'll see how vastly different they are. Booker T. Washington is born in 1856 in the slaveholding state of Virginia. So, Booker T. Washington is born into slavery. Once emancipated in 18, he'll go to Hampton Institute, where he will walk 500 miles to Hampton Institute to be able to go, and he'll work his way through school as a janitor. The school headmaster, whose name was General Samuel Armstrong, will give him a scholarship because he sees how hard he's working. In 1881, the Alabama legislature approved a $2,000 grant, essentially, for a Black institution to start a Black school. And so in 1881, Booker T. Washington founds the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, where it will train Black people in agricultural enterprises. And so you're probably wondering, why train them in agricultural enterprises instead of training them in the more classical studies where they can learn history and literature and all of these other things? At this time, the majority of African Americans live in the South, and a lot of them are farming. And so he says that if I can teach you better agricultural practices, you'll be more successful. So in 1881, he founds Tuskegee. And one thing that I find that's pretty amazing about the school is that the students actually help to build the school. They will actually build the bricks that are needed for the buildings in the school. They will actually help to build this school. Booker T. Washington is often, I'll say, he is often um, criticized for his Atlanta Compromise speech, what's called the Atlanta Compromise speech. He is speaking at an exposition in Atlanta to a Black and white segregated audience. And he says there to both Black and white people to cast down your buckets where you are. And many people will see this as him telling Black people to accept segregation. In a way, is he telling Black people to accept segregation? Yes, he will urge Blacks to not combat racial segregation. Instead, he will urge Black people to get ahead economically. He believed African Americans should have a technical education versus a classical or a classical education. And he really is, I'll say, he is a huge, what is the word I'm looking for? he is a huge supporter of economic autonomy or independence. He will really urge Black people to get ahead economically. So um in your module for this week, if I remember, I will put a copy of the Atlanta Compromise speech. And I want you guys to read over this speech, or I'll create another video in explaining this speech. Um, but a lot of Booker T. Washington will be criticized by a lot of modern Black historians, a lot of modern historians, period, for his idea or for his belief in not combating a lot of the racial segregation and racial violence that's happening at the time. But you have to remember that this is a man who was born into slavery. And so he's like, we need to get to our Black people need to succeed economically. If you are going to farm, you need to be the best farmer. In his Atlanta Compromise speech, as it's often called, he even tells Black people there is as much honor in tilling a field as there is in writing a poem. So don't think that being a farmer is low class work. It's not. There's a lot of honor in that. So one of the reasons why he's really criticized is that he's saying a lot of these things at a time where violence against African Americans is at an all-time high. Between 1883 and 1905, nearly 50 plus Black people are lynched every year, and it's mostly Black men. So this is like a lynching a week or more, because even though it says, about 50 to 60, those are the ones that we know of. Those are the ones of people that we can identify. But there were many, many more, and they're still recovering, or trying to recover victims of lynchings. Many of the victims of lynchings were accused of raping white women, because there was this idea that that society had to preserve the purity of white womanhood, and that idea, the preserving the purity of white women, was seen as a justification of lynching. So he is really criticized because he is telling Black people not to fight racial discrimination and segregation at a time where Black men are being lynched just because they're accused of raping a white woman or raping a white woman. In your PowerPoint, I included a newspaper clipping of the lynching of Sam Hose. With a lot of these lynchings, the reason we have pictures and things now is because a lot of the time these lynchings were community events. There was no shame in killing Black people at this time. They were community events. People would bring their children. Um, it- People would take pictures of the lynching. Okay, people would take pictures, people would make postcards of the pictures of the lynched individual. So these were not seen as horrible events. These were seen as community gathering events for the white community. It's at this time that we get a famed anti-lynching crusader named Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was really um, catapulted into this position after one of her good friends is lynched. And so she becomes an anti-lynching crusader, where she will write scathing articles about what is happening to Black men in the South. Now, politics, religion, and memory. The Civil War, at this time, we get the altering of history, where the Civil War is not seen as, a segregationist mob attacking the United States. Instead, it's seen more like a tragic family quarrel among white Americans in which Blacks play a little or no part. Slavery is seen as a minor issue. We get the redrawing of history where it's not necessarily true. And so now at this time, we have historians like me who are attempting to tell the real story of American history, because a lot of these stories were rewritten in the South, especially by former Confederates, where slavery is written as a minor issue and Reconstruction is seen as a regrettable period of Negro rule. The Old South is romanticized in this vision of American history. History books in both the North and the South will emphasize happy slaves, and they'll emphasize the horrors and evils of the Reconstruction period. And so when you think about that and how our memory of the Civil War is changed and it's altered and it's put in history books, it makes sense that you'll get a movie such as Birth of a Nation, but I'll discuss that in the next chapter or two. So in the 1890s, there's also a major shift in immigration to America. About 3.5 million people will enter the US during the period of the 1890s. And most of them will be from Southern and Eastern Europe. So Italy, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1894, the Immigration Restriction League will call for a reduction in immigration by barring anyone who can't read from entering the United States. At this time, one of the groups that is really discriminated against as far as immigration are the Chinese. Both political parties, both Republicans and Democrats, will express pretty vicious and racist opinions regarding Chinese immigrants. So in 1875, Congress will exclude Chinese women from entering the country. And you're probably wondering, why would they exclude Chinese women? Because if the women are not there, then the population cannot increase. Okay. In 1880, there will be a treaty called the Burlingame Treaty. I'm sorry, in 1868, the Burlingame Treaty will be signed, which will establish friendly relations between the US and China. So it will allow Chinese immigrants to come into the country, but it withholds naturalization. So you can come into the nation, but you cannot become a citizen. And so that is before Chinese women are banned. And so things will continue to get worse and worse. So in 1868, Chinese can come to the country, but they can't become citizens. 1875, Chinese women cannot come in the country. 1882, Congress will temporarily exclude all immigrants from China. By this time, about 105,000 Chinese lived in the United States, mostly on the West Coast, and they'll face a lot of violence and a lot of discrimination. In 1892, something called the Geary Act was passed, which essentially it extended the Exclusion Act, or the Chinese Exclusion Act, for 10 more years. And so in 1893, there's a Supreme Court case known as Fong Yuting versus the United States. This court case will authorize the federal government to expel Chinese aliens without due process of law. So, the way this happens is that you have a number of immigrants who are arrested. And when they're arrested, they're like, hey, we don't have any due process. You arrested us without due process of the law. Their cases will go all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will say, yeah, but that's okay. You can be arrested without due process, and you can be expelled from the nation without due process. So while we see the late 1800s, the 1880s, and the 1890s as kind of like a golden era for immigration, it's really not. Um, Chinese immigrants are expelled. It's an era where, while European immigrants will, especially in the Gilded Age, for example, will begin to vote, there's a huge reduction of the vote with African Americans in this country. There's a reduction, I would say. You really get to question the meaning of citizenship. who deserves citizenship in this nation? I would say in the late 1800s, that's a question that we really have to ask ourselves. Who is deserving of citizenship? What does our country, what do our laws say about who is deserving of citizenship? So obviously, Chinese people are not deserving of citizenship. Black people, while the 14th Amendment grants citizenship, you don't have the rights of citizenship. Okay? So it really brings these things into question. All right, so the last thing we'll talk about is labor and imperialism, which you're probably like, oh my goodness, this is going to go on for a long time, but no. So it's also during this time that we see the rise of the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL. The AFL is founded by Samuel Gompers, and he really believed that the labor movement needed to devote itself to negotiating with employers for higher wages and for better working conditions for its members and for its workers. And in the 1890s, the movement really restricted membership to, however, skilled workers. So remember, Blacks could not become skilled workers. So with the AFL, while it has, I would say, a good foundation, where they really want the labor movement to devote itself to having better working conditions and better wage for its workers, it excludes its membership or restricts its membership to skilled workers, therefore restricting nearly all Blacks, nearly all women, and nearly all immigrants from its membership. The 1890s also begins the women's era. It's this 30-year period where women are beginning to enjoy greater opportunities for economic independence and greater visibility, honestly. Women will play a greater role in public life, and states will begin to adopt laws where married women can have control over their own wages. Who would have thunk, right? Where they'll have control over their own property and the right to sign separate contracts and make separate wills. So the legal identity of women is evolving and changing, where they're able to have, while it may not be a completely separate legal identity, there is some separation in their legal identity. The 1890s will also begin an era where you'll have a generation of college educated women who will begin to get better paying jobs as in clerical positions and in professional positions. One of the era's largest female organizations was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU. The WCTU is founded in 1874, and they will really rally for economic and political reform. We'll talk a lot more about the WCTU because that T stands for temperance. And when we're talking about temperance, it means temperance or restriction of alcohol. So when we'll talk more about the WCTU when we get to the 20th century. The last quarter of the 19th century is also known as the Age of Imperialism because by this time, most of Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific has been colonized, right? Now, the justification for this imperial expansion is that you're bringing civilization and you're bringing civilization to the backwards people of the non-Western world. So, a lot of these indigenous and a lot of these indigenous groups are instructed in Western values and labor practices and Christianity, and saying that, okay, we'll take over for this amount of time, but eventually you'll be given the right to govern yourself. So that is imperialism, and the U.S. has a pretty decent, um, and by decent, I'm not meaning good, but lengthy, imperialist history. And so we'll talk about the Spanish American War and then the Philippine War. So the Spanish American War is in 1898. It's a movement for independence of Cuba from Spain. Okay, Cuba, it wants independence from Spain. So in February 15th, 1898, an explosion destroyed an American battleship, the American battleship Maine, in Havana Harbor. And the press blamed Spain for the explosion without even really having any evidence that it was Spain. President McKinley will go to Congress and he will ask for a declaration of war, which will be granted. And the purpose of this war declaration was to aid Cuba in their struggle for, quote, liberty and freedom. The Spanish are defeated. And after this, a lot of Spain's territories are divided and given to the United States. So the U.S. gets the Philippines, they get Puerto Rico, Guam, and a permanent naval station in Cuba known as Guantanamo Bay. Now, the issue, however, while many Cubans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans, while some of them welcomed American intervention, um, a lot of the way that the US will intervene and the way that the US will exercise their control will lead them to have a change in opinion. And that brings us to the Philippine War, which will last from 1899 to 1902. The Philippine War is both longer and bloodier than the Spanish American War, and it will be fought between American forces and Filipino nationalists. Um, in the Philippines, they don't want a change of colonial rulers. They want true independence. So, this is what the war is fought over. It is fought for true independence and not just a change of colonial rulers. At the end, about 4,200 Americans and about 20,000 Filipinos, Filipino combatants will be killed, and an additional 200,000 Filipino civilians will die from famine, disease, and violence. And so, this is why this era is also known as the Age of Imperialism, because America is taking control of all of these territories. Um, and not giving these territories any independence. Instead, America will take this idea that I know, even though I am a foreigner, I am not from here. I know what is best for you. That is what imperialism is. That is imperialism really summed up in a nutshell. It's this idea that this other country knows better than you do. So this is where we end. The next module is module 4, and that will be over chapter 18. So start reading chapter 18, and I'll see you guys again next week.